So, in the context of the 1980s, just to give a little bit of background on some of the changes that were happening broadly, that also really informed the ways that the HIV/AIDS crisis played out, and also some of the larger structures that were changing the forms of queer spaces and queer cultures that were being enacted in different cities. So in the 1980s, we do see this intense backlash to a lot of the civil and social movements of the late 1960s and 70s. We do see the expansion of the private sector and this kind of increased mobility for business. So while it's of course it's more complicated than this is not a comprehensive analysis of the 1980s, but a lot of the kind of stereotypes about the 80s being associated with greed, being associated with kind of unfettered global capitalism was in fact really accurate in terms of the ways that the kind of expansion of the private sector, as I mentioned. So companies having a lot more power, the kind of larger attacks on things like social safety nets and welfare programs. We see this kind of the rhetoric of this hard on crime approach. So um, a lot of the issues around the war on drugs really came out in the 1980s. So this kind of narrative of the way to curb the issues of drug use and drug addiction and drug culture was to criminalize and basically just put people in jail en masse. And as we know, this war on drugs was a complete failure. It was even later we have people from the Nixon administration admitting that kind of the precedent for the war on drugs was in fact to put people of color, particularly Black communities, and specifically Black men in prison. So it was this deliberate attack on communities of color, and this kind of changing of drug laws and to for instance the so-called epidemic of crack use, crack cocaine. So, for instance, the administrations would the charges for use of things like crack cocaine were much higher than they were for powdered cocaine. And so this association was that Black folks, Black communities will be using crack cocaine, and so being given these harsher penalties, put in prison for nonviolent offenses, and instead of dealing with drug use as a public health concern, criminalizing communities, breaking up families. And so, of course, this was affecting queer communities, it was affecting queer people of color. Um, and so, this hard on crime approach was broadly also used to criminalize queer communities in other ways, not just around drug use, but this idea of cleaning up cities. And so, this kind of early form of gentrifying was very explicitly mobilized in the ways that we've also talked about these anti vice campaigns against queer communities and queer bars. So, the anti vice campaigns that were arguing that things like liquor, drug use, sex work, they would, of course, use the term prostitution, um, were public ills, blights on the community that needed to be stomped out. And so this was, of course, done by violently um, criminalizing communities, putting people in prison en masse, instead of approaching these things as I said, public health. So this hard on crime approach and this idea of cleaning up the city was really used in a way that pushed back against a lot of the burgeoning queer and trans nightclub scenes. So a lot of these underground cultures were really pushed even further to the margins. And in many ways, a lot of the spaces that queer people had been using, for instance, in major cities like New York, where we see a very clear push through the 1980s and the 1990s to um, clean up the cities, which we can kind of read ostensibly clean up the cities for straight white upwardly mobile families. And so that rhetoric was really used to dismantle social safety nets, to um, demolish queer spaces, to explicitly go against anything that was associated with queerness or transness or queer sex. So a lot of really negative anti-queer, racist rhetoric and policy that was being enacted on marginalized communities. So we have Ronald Reagan in the States. We have Brian Mulroney, who was also very conservative in Canada. And this kind of the gap between the wealthy and those who were poor or underemployed or working class was extremely expanded. So, and we can see the fruits of that really in the past 10 years, and the way that a lot of these early forms of trying to deregulate the free market, this idea of the free market, so that capitalism will just figure itself out. Um, allowing the rich to get richer, big business to flourish, and this kind of deliberate policy, but also very much discursive attack on things like social safety nets like welfare. So this is where we get kind of the racist stereotype, the racist language of the welfare queen, which was used against Black women, Black mothers. This idea that people who needed welfare, people who were poor, were drains on the economy, were drains on the system. So we see this rhetoric of this kind of bootstrap appeal that if you work hard enough, you will be able to access the kinds of capital that everyone should want. So this kind of rhetoric of the cleaning up communities, hard on crime, war on drugs. So this is happening at the same time as the AIDS crisis. So we need to be considering these kind of larger forms of anti-queer, anti-Black, racist, anti-poor ideas and policy that is being enacted through specific government administrations, and then of course trickling down into communities. So this image here is a very iconic image from the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 1980s. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of Keith Haring, who was an artist who had a very particular style, but started off before he was very well known, doing these kinds of public art projects. So we might, we kind of associate that with, the artist Banksy, but this idea of doing spontaneous work on subways, public murals, really trying to bring images of the queer community to the public. So similar to ACT UP, the group that was staging all these large-scale protests, we see artists using their skills to create visible cultural memory, visible icons of queerness, challenging the government. And then, of course, we see Keith Haring is explicitly using the language of ACT UP, silence equals death, fight AIDS, ACT UP. And Keith Haring was another victim of the HIV/AIDS crisis. He died in 1990. So that's kind of the background I'll give on the HIV/AIDS crisis. But then, of course, as we talk about these next few scenes that I'm going to be going through, we need to be constantly keeping that in the back of our mind, that these scenes that we might see as very bright and flamboyant. We see a lot of images of partying and fun and joy, and it's of course important to sit with that and see forms of queer and trans joy, queer and trans community. But this is of course happening in the context of these intense right-wing pushes against marginalized communities, against communities of color, against queer communities. And so those images that we see then of queer spectacle, of drag, of joy, they take on a different meaning in that context. So in the next part of the lecture, we will be looking at some selected drag scenes. So I have touched a bit on Woodstock, so we're going to watch a few clips on the Woodstock celebration founded by Lady Bunny, and kind of doing a cursory introduction to ballroom culture. So we associate that with voguing, a particular dance style that has a really important history within queer and trans community, particularly Black and Latinx communities in major cities like New York and in LA, and looking at the legendary houses. So, a lot of the language on RuPaul draws from Paris is Burning, draws from this particular culture. RuPaul was, of course, living in New York at the time that Paris is Burning was filmed in 1987, and it came out in 1990, and was a part of Club Kids scene. Had knowledge of the voguing scene, had knowledge of these of the house scene, so was enmeshed in this kind of culture. And a lot of the language we see on the show, uses the history of houses, so drag houses, um, and the kind of the names of drag houses we will find also really familiar, such as Extravaganza. And so as we prepare to really delve into voguing ballroom culture in week 6, we'll kind of be doing a cursory look at some of the kind of the historical background of ballroom cultures. And I will also look a little bit at Club Kids. So this is happening the late 1980s to the mid 1990s. And then kind of doing a close look at the terrorist drag of Vaginal Cream Davis, what Munoz refers to as the terrorist drag. And then a little bit about some local drag. So looking at the House of Rice and Man Up.